to the Blue Economy, Sustainable and Resilient session. The Commonwealth's oceans hold an immense amount of cultural significance and economic potential. Fisheries, tourism, aquaculture and blue carbon. And in today's session, we're going to talk about how we can leverage these sustainably by working with the state and the private and public sector to collaborate in partnership. I'm joined by an expert panel who really do represent all of the stakeholders across the spectrum that will enable this to be possible. On my left is Colin Buckley, Managing Director and General Counsel for BII. Amanda Ellis, who is the Executive Director of Asia Pacific Global Institute of Sustainable Innovation. Kenneth Catafono, Managing Director and Founder of Traceable Solutions. And Howard Palatino, Chair of the Pacific Island Private Sector Organisation. And finally, last but by no means least, Dr. Sanjayanan, CEO of Conservation International. And I'm Louise Quay. I'm the Managing Director for Chemonics UK. We have 6,000 team members in 100 countries, all operating to try to improve health and happiness and independence outcomes for their citizens. We really do see the environment as being a key component to this. We're delighted to be able to operate the Climate Finance Development Accelerator on behalf of the USAID. This is a £250 million programme that seeks to unlock catalytic capital to enable $2 billion of private sector investment. We also run Mobilist, which is the UK flagship programme that seeks to invest institutional capital in emerging markets. And finally, we operate Chem Capital, which seeks to invest in early-stage innovations to enable them to tackle local problems. OK, so I'm going to dig in. I have a question for all of our panel members, which is how can governments, philanthropy and the private sector collaborate more effectively to scale sustainable projects across the Commonwealth, particularly in those regions that are most vulnerable to climate change? And I'm going to kick off with Amanda.
Reo, e ngā rangatiratanga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and talofa lava. So I have just greeted you in Māori, the indigenous language of my birth island, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And many people ask, okay, you've greeted everybody as leaders, as of course all of you are in this room, but why repeat tēnā koutou 3 times? And it's because the ancestors are always with us. Those of us in the room today have a pivotal role to play, but most importantly, the third is for future generations. And in thinking about public-private partnerships, we really do need to think about youth and how we are enabling just and sustainable futures for them, both grounded in Indigenous wisdoms and being able to leverage high tech. So we heard on the previous panel some wonderfully important points about skills and why it is so important to be upskilling workforces for the future. But I wanted to start with something a little more basic, and that's an interesting collaborative which is bringing together private sector and government expertise to actually figure out where are the biggest sources of emissions. So those of you who have computers, it's harder on your phone, climatetrace.org, tracking real-time atmospheric climate emissions, gives you some real insights into where the biggest sources of emissions are. Then for parliamentarians, groups of universities, which we again heard about in the previous panel, have come together through the London School of Economics to do a global database of laws relating to climate. And that, for the politicians in the room, is very important. And for those of us who are in the private sector and want to influence the politicians, also very important. You can search by country, or you can search by the kind of law you want to look at. So putting that enabling environment in place is really important. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of public-private partnerships that are going to scale in our region. So first of all, starting in Fiji, there's a project for remote islands with microgrids, which is a partnership between the Laboratory for Energy and Power Solutions and the Green Growth Institute. So looking at how we can come together with a private sector and public sector support in terms of financing to take microgrids to scale, especially in remote islands. And then I'll just perhaps give one other example, and that's an example from right here in Samoa. Some of you will know Women in Business Development, and run by Andi Tafunai. And in a former life, I led New Zealand's development agency, NZAID, and we partnered with Andi to scale her model of virgin coconut oil presses through family and women-led businesses, so families could stay in situ and continue to work the land, and then that coconut oil would be bought by WIBD. It's now the single largest product for the Body Shop. So a wonderful example of how a public-private collaboration led by Indigenous women's wisdom can scale. And finally, USAID came in and helped to scale it across the Caribbean. So thank you, Louise.
That's a fabulous example of how the Pacific region can show leadership for the whole of the Commonwealth. Over to you. We'll just turn to Howard while the mic's... Howard.
Hi. Great. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see anything anymore. All right, so the question's a fantastic question, and it's clear that it is the pathway. Answering that question really is the pathway for long-term sustained conservation and sustained financing. So the role of philanthropy, the role of government, and the role of private sector, right? So what I would say is risk, de-risk, and accelerate. So the role of private philanthropy is to take risks. They don't do that. Typically, philanthropy, even though the philanthropists behind those philanthropies tend to be some of the people who are champions of risk-taking, in their private philanthropy still tend to go after sure things. And it's a weird thing. I don't actually understand the psychology of that. But people are willing to take big risks in their own business or in their own capital, like for capital formation. But when it comes to giving money, they still want a sure thing. And so we have to move private philanthropy into this model that you're the only source of flexible money. You can actually take a risk on things. You can try things that may not work, that are really difficult to pull off. Right? That's the role of private philanthropy. The role of government is to de-risk projects. And governments are also pretty bad at doing that. And that's mostly to do with election cycles. But the role of government is to provide that level playing field and long-term assurances that an investment, in either philanthropic investment or a private capital investment, is going to not be overturned by a government policy that is coming down the road a few years from now. It's to provide that first loss capital, where government is saying, if you're a company, you're coming in and you want to invest in blue carbon, or you want to invest in mangroves, or you want to invest in reefs, or whatever you want to do, we will take the first loss because we know you're making an investment, and we'll guarantee that part of it. So governments tend to be pretty bad at that. And then private capital. So for me, private capital is all about accelerating. Governments right now are cash-strapped. Private philanthropy has not kept up with the accumulation of wealth. If you really look at how much private philanthropy is going in versus the accumulation of wealth in the world, it's still lagging by a long shot, by many factors, I would say. So what really is going to power a blue economy or going to power conservation in the long run, it is private capital. And it has been flowing. It's there. And I can see it continuing to grow because the one thing I know is going to be more valuable tomorrow than it is today, and that's nature. So that's sort of my, we got to get private philanthropy to take risks. We got to get governments to establish policies that will de-risk investments, and we got to get private capital flowing at scale. Thanks.
I love that. We've got a call for action already. That's great. Howard.
Thank you. It's business as usual. We talk about risk, and risk doesn't just belong to the financial sector where we use the terminology, but risk is something that we've grown up with in anything new that we've done as humankind. And I think we need to keep in context as we reflect in our values, particularly in the Blue Pacific, about traditions and so on, and why we did certain things and why we didn't do certain things at certain times of the year, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the collaboration that is needed is because we've kind of created society and compartmentalized it. So we have government, we have private sector, we have civil society. But hey, the common denominator is we're all people. We're all people in there. And people have impacted the environment, but particularly again with private sector and its products. We began to detect that, hey, some of these products, you can't eat them, you can't drink them, you toss them away. And so now we have a big problem with plastics and so on. And I acknowledge the work of the South Pacific Tourism Organization here. I think the CEOs might be in the room here, who started this plastics campaign about looking at plastics and what we do with plastics in the tourism industry, which for one of the countries under the PIPSO, Fiji, is big, and for many of us, we've got different scopes of our tourism industry. But again, I think the environment is something that we've grown up with, we've connected with, and I look like I've been on the planet for just as long as the oldest one here. And we remember going to the river to get food, going to the mangroves to get firewood, going fishing, eating this particular seaweed, don't touch that one, getting stung by this and not stung by that. But today now we're talking about blue carbon, and I just had to ask our learned, distinguished guest here to explain that, and he is talking about what exists under that blue ocean. So as people in the blue ocean stage, so the big ocean stage, I like to think of that, because while the landmass is small, hey, our backyard is that big, big ocean, and we need to protect it and so on. So I think, again, it's collaboration. It's coming to the table with all the stakeholders and of actually getting plans done. And like we do in private sector, you follow the plan, you measure it, you have KPIs, because you want to get it done at the end of the day, because the other P is at the end, and that's profitability. And profitability doesn't only have to be in dollars and cents. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Colin.
So I think it's really appropriate that we end the entire 2 days with this session, because I think this session sort of stitches together a lot of what we have been talking about. It also gives us a chance to sort of recognize the importance of small island states like Samoa, who have been fantastic hosts over this week. And it also underlines the promise of the Commonwealth. So by way of introduction, I'm the managing director of British International Investment, which is a development finance institution. We invest over $6 billion in private companies in the Commonwealth. So I see the world, and I see especially economic development, through the lens of investing in businesses. And here's what I thought I would do. I would try and stitch together some of what we've learned over the last 2 days about what the limitations are, what the risks are. But then I thought I'd take a shot along with you of trying to come up with an investment that actually dodges all of those risks and hits the opportunities that are in this space, and especially in the sort of the blue economy space. So the Prime Minister of Samoa started out all of the proceedings by talking about the constraints on economic development that are faced by small island states. And we've heard a lot of this. They're small. There's not a lot of scale. We've heard about the fact that they are vulnerable to setbacks. Those setbacks might be climate change. They might be foreign exchange issues or so forth. They also often lack infrastructure. That could be hard infrastructure like ports. It could be soft infrastructure like education and the investment climate. And beyond all of these constraints, there are also choices that countries want to make about what is the type of growth that they want. The age of the Washington Consensus, where economic development only comes in one flavor, are now over. And island states, I think, choose a particular type of growth that they want. And what is that growth? I think that is growth that leads into their opportunities. This is growth that is consistent with their values. Small island states, especially here in the Pacific, have a huge amount of inherent trust and respect throughout the world as custodians of the ocean, as being uniquely connected with nature. And SIDS also have, they own the ocean. They own 70% of the ocean in this area, as you say, enormous backyards. So those are the opportunities that we're going to play with. People respect them, and they own a lot of water, or the rights over a lot of water. So when we look for investments, we look for two things. We look for scale. We want big businesses. I had the opportunity to share a panel with Mayday over here and hear her story about a farm here in Samoa. And those are wonderful, and they employ lots of people. But let's have aspirations. Let's go for something really big and really global. And the other thing we're looking for is value add. We're not going to sell breadfruit on the international markets. We want something unique. Value add is usually processing. Here, let's work with brand, because that trust that everyone has in Pacific states, and let's work with that. So how do we stitch all of this together into an investment? Well, we're here in Samoa, and in honor of Robert Louis Stevenson, who's buried on some godforsaken mountain somewhere that poor Lord Moreland have to just behind us, let's call our business Treasure Island Fisheries, and let's headquarter it right here in Apia. And here's what Treasure Island Fisheries does. Treasure Island Fisheries is a partnership amongst all of the Pacific small island states who gather together and in a treaty decide that they will require certain sustainable fishing practices for any fishing licenses that they offer in their space. And in return for this, all of the fish that come from the special economic zones will be branded with the Treasure Island brand. And this will have value to those of us like me in London who, when we want to buy fish, want to know that that fish is fished in a sustainable value, in a sustainable way. And we will pay a premium for that. And that premium then gets paid over to the governments of these states. Now, 25 years of investing has taught me few lessons, but one of them is I'm a miserable entrepreneur. So please, those of you out here who actually run businesses, don't poke holes in it. But the merits of these types of ideas is it builds on all the opportunities that we have, and builds on, and also points up the necessities. It builds on the opportunities about brand, about using the oceans. But along the way, it also means that we have to combine ourselves. It requires government action. And that's one lesson that I have learned, that in small countries, the government has to drive businesses. In large countries, businesses can live with benign neglect, but they can't do that in small countries. So this requires government action. It requires Commonwealth partners coming together, agreeing on this treaty, and extracting the value, the core values of Pacific Islands. This care for the ocean, the importance of sustainability builds a brand and creates income for the states. So that's kind of the constraints, and that's also how we might reflect the constraints in an opportunity.
Fabulous. We're going to talk a little bit more in a moment about governments and regulatory environments. The joy of this panel is the range of expertise we have. And sitting next to you is Ken, who probably would know most about setting up Treasure Island fisheries. And I'd love to get your perspective on this question.
Thanks, Louise. And Buluvnak, everyone. So I'm coming from the perspective of a very small, slightly risky tech company based in Fiji who are innovating solutions in the agriculture and fisheries sectors, working largely in developing countries. And so I think on the question of collaboration, certainly very much needed for little companies like us who have aspirations to operate and see our solutions used globally. So I think a couple of years ago in 2021, the Commonwealth Secretariat had a little pilot program for business development services where they offered capacity building. And they invited 22 organizations from across the Commonwealth who were working in the agriculture, fisheries, and digital sectors. And so we were one of the two companies from the Pacific that was part of that capacity building. Because it was a pilot program, I guess they were finding their feet in terms of how the capacity building was delivered. But it was an opportunity for us as a little company to see what folks were doing in the Caribbean or in Africa, and in different parts of the world, and to see how our solutions could help those companies or countries, and how we could partner with others in those spaces. And again, I think for us, we've always had the view that if we, as a small business, if we waited for government to enable things for us, we wouldn't be operating today. So, we've had to pivot, we've had to innovate, and, today we operate in several Pacific Island countries, in the African region. We've done work in Southeast Asia, and we are looking to do a lot more of that with just a very small team of people, all based in Fiji. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And that leads me on to my next question, which is, you clearly had some help in capacity building, but what other frameworks and incentives could the government have put in place to encourage your business, and to do so in such a way that it prioritised resilience and sustainability?
Yeah, thanks. So I think apart from providing an enabling environment and the necessary regulations and whatnot, I think it would be good for government to be able to learn to work better with small companies like us. I think it's easier for governments to spend $1 million on big solutions from outside of the country than it is to spend a couple of tens of thousands of dollars from an entrepreneur within the country. Yeah, and I think that's been the experience in many Pacific Island countries from our experience. So I think just more recently, I think over the last 3 years, we've started to have a lot more government work. So the government of Seychelles, the government of Vanuatu, and now a lot more work with the government of Fiji. And so I think over time, we've kind of had to learn how to be able to get those contracts, how to be able to pitch our services and our products. And we've been successful, but it could have been a lot easier if those enabling mechanisms were
there
in place. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Ken. Same question to you, Colin, but I would also ask, is there an opportunity here for governments across the Commonwealth to harmonise to really create sustainable development?
Well, yes, that's why part of my thought problem kind of required governments to kind of coordinate and set those standards in return for getting to scale. But I think there's also a role for government inside their own countries. And let me be clear, small island states share more differences than they share things in common. And so when we talk about what are the reforms that a government has to do, we have to start with what does the government want to accomplish in that particular country to promote the economic development of that country. So, for example, in Pacific states, I would think most of it would be to promote investment in SMEs. And so that would lead you to pretty much to making sure that you have strong financial institutions, that you have strong incentives for banks to use their capital to actually make investments in operating businesses. You might provide tax incentives with that regard. And that's what you would focus on, and you wouldn't focus on capital markets, for example. So I think it's very important that you begin with what does the government want, which leads you back to the requirement for government industrial policy. I think in small countries, real economic development is not going to happen by accident. It is going to have to happen in a purposeful way. And reform needs to support that purpose.
Thank you. Howard, have you got any examples of where you have seen some of those incentives really making a big impact to your members?
Yeah, no, I absolutely, support the fact of knowledge, science is fact, awareness, and I believe we need to look at our mindsets. Because while we will focus back on tradition and cultural ways of doing things, where we started in the bartering system, to where we are today, where you don't even need cash. And we're kind of operating ourselves from the sky up here. So we need education, and education, I mean right down into the institutes called schools, right from the primary schools and so on. We get it early. And perhaps it is opportune time to just feed those gadgets that our children and our grandchildren have spent so much time on, in not so much being entertained, but by being educated as to our environment and, pollution and why we should keep things clean and so on. So very much education, I think, and I think government has got to drive this. They're being the ones responsible for the education of a society and a community, and remove any of the barriers that still exist in some countries, barriers of affordability, barriers around disability, where if a child has a disability, it doesn't mean to say that child doesn't have a brain that can be educated. And I've discovered this in my work out with disabilities, particularly in the deaf and so on. Kids were deaf in the village, and so they just left until somebody came along and said, let's start something. And now we get them educated. They're working in the workforce. And we get feedback from employers say, we love this worker because he's not distracted. He's on the job and so on. So there's value in everything. We all got some form of disability, I think. So yes, very much education. And I think the education right across the spectrum, from they can learn how to have a bottle and drink mom's milk and so on. They're open to learning everything, and particularly our environment is one of the first places. Thank you.
Fabulous. Sanjan, anything to add?
Well, what I would say is that, governments really need to think about policy coherence. So when we talk about sustainability or the blue economy, the truth of the matter is that, there are many other ministries involved in those discussions beyond the Environment Ministry or the Fisheries Ministry. or the Marine Ocean Ministry, and the lack of policy coherence with governments and between governments is a huge impediment to ultimately what I think we all are trying to achieve. I think the second thing we ought to be thinking about, and you used the word incentive, and I would say it as subsidy reforms, because if you look at what is needed for, there's studies that show that a very large number, something like $700 billion, are needed for really powering nature and biodiversity and protecting it. I don't exactly know the exact number, and it's actually relevant, except to say it's much, much, much bigger than the numbers that so far has been mobilized by the multilateral agencies, by governments, and by philanthropy. So really, to get to that number, you really have to think about subsidy reform. And that is what really helps create that level playing field. I think beyond that, I think there are some good examples where governments are leaning in. We talked a little bit about Kenya, but Kenya recently went through a process where they established kind of guiding principles on how they will look at their carbon markets. And it's not perfect. It needs work. We think it's good. It could be better. But the fact that they went ahead and proactively did it is really a great, great signal. And I think those are the signals that we really need from governments to be able to create that level of certainty, around carbon markets, around the restoration economy, around fisheries, that ultimately can bring in the investments we need for a truly sustainable blue economy. And it's going to happen, but it's going to happen in one of two ways. And the first way is not what you want, but it's likely the way in which it's going right now. So if you look at what's going on in Europe today, and I think it'll happen in the United States as well, in order for these countries to meet their lofty targets, which they're essentially unable to do within their own economies, they're going to put up barriers to trade from countries in the global south. Right? So they're going to insist that the global south act in a certain way around deforestation, around fisheries, around things like that they themselves have actually never done. Right? And, you could argue about that, but nevertheless, those laws are coming. And they will add a level of protectionism for their local markets that countries, particularly in the global south, the Commonwealth nations, will have to find a way to get above and beyond. Otherwise, you won't be able to sell in those markets. The other side, the more positive way to look at it is, and I would say particularly for island states, sustainability and resilience is built into island nations. That is exactly how, island nations have survived for so many thousands of years, given how resource poor in some ways they are, right? It's really because of a built-in system, a traditional knowledge system of sustainability. So it is in your own enlightened self-interest to get there, and ideally get there faster than the regulatory, hammer that no doubt is being swung right now.
Thank you. Amanda, over to you.
Well, subsidies is something that I'm really passionate about as well, being a very boring economist. And I have a question for the audience. I might even give a prize. Can anyone tell me what the quantum of subsidies, both explicit and implicit, for fossil fuels are, as estimated by both the IMF and the World Bank? Any wild guesses? Just yell out. And I'll give you a clue. It's more than $1 million. Any guesses? $1 trillion. Do I have an advance on $1 trillion? $2 trillion. Do I have an advance on $2 trillion? It's shocking. $5 trillion. Do I have an advance on $5 trillion? We're getting close. 6. It's $7.1 trillion. Now, this is absolutely ludicrous when we look at the size of the global economy and what we're incentivizing. What is even more ludicrous is that the estimate from the IMF is that we would have a drop in emissions by 2030 of 34% were we to get rid of those subsidies. So, and we need to get to close to 50. So that would take us a long way there. It is absolutely ridiculous. So I could not agree more with the other panel members that getting rid of subsidies is an absolute must-do. We have, of course, the same perverse incentives with agricultural and fisheries subsidies as we're talking about the blue economy. And those pirates in Somalia will tell you if the Spanish were not subsidizing their ships to do distant water fishing in other people's zones, there may be a few less pirates. So it really is a global problem, and it's one that the Commonwealth could take a lead on by making the point. Second of all, an issue that nobody has talked about yet. We've talked about entrepreneurism, which we really want to encourage. But women entrepreneurs do not have the same access to legal rights as male counterparts. And I have another question for you. What percentage of legal rights do women have economically, globally, that men have? And I'll tell you, it's not 100%. It's actually now less than 70%. This is a project at the World Bank called Women, Business and the Law. If you're interested in looking, you can search for your country and see what laws still need to be changed to implement a level playing field. And it's so important that we allow full participation by all members of society if we're going to be able to privilege not only blue economy, but also green economy. And what is interesting is that a couple of recent studies show that where women are able to be involved in government, and we have only one woman minister for 4 men and 1 woman parliamentarian for 3 men, where women are involved in governance, there is a greater emphasis on sustainability. Now, research has shown the same thing with women in senior leadership roles and with women in the boardroom. And just this week, we know the IMF and World Bank meetings are happening in Washington, D.C. There is a partnership between the World Bank and women political leaders that has done research that actually shows where we have more women in governance roles too, that leads to more engagement, not only with privileging women's entrepreneurship, but also with sustainability overall. So we can see that gender equality and privileging a level playing field for women entrepreneurs will actually help us with our sustainability goals. Thank you.
And just to add to your point, Amanda, we also know that when women are making decisions around capital investment, the returns are also greater. So it's across the board. Thank you for that. We talked a lot about things that government can do to unlock potential. I want to ask if there are any specific innovations, technical innovations or policies that are needed to ensure that ocean-based industries can contribute to long-term sustainability, but also economic resilience, particularly for the SIDS. And I'm going to start with Ken.
So I think from the government perspective, and our experience has certainly been as a small company trying to work a lot closer with government. So I think some of the challenges for us has been these very long processes, tender processes, just to get into the door. And so, being able to change that could certainly help. And, just going back to the blue economy and how the challenges that we're facing in that space requires, I think, a different way of working, different way of thinking compared to what we've been doing in the past. And that's not just from the entrepreneurial side, but also from the government side, I think, as well. And so we need to do some work in that space.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Colin, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll take the opportunity to sort of kind of resist the temptations of innovation. I think when we talk about investment climate and government reform, the path is pretty well set. And the IFC doing business reports kind of sets out what you really need. And there's no real magic about this. Some of these issues have been highlighted as Commonwealth values, the sort of rule of law and primacy of courts and so forth. And some of it is just getting the details right, having a land registry, having a credit agency, having a settled way of doing a security interest and so forth. So there's not a lot of magic here. I think most businesses, their requests of government is just do the kind of expected, do what everyone expects a functioning government to have in order to have an investment climate. So do the normal, park innovation for the moment.
Excellent, thank you. Do you agree with that, Howard, or would you have a different perspective?
Well, I'm asking the question, what is our common wealth? What is our regional wealth? And it seems very obvious to me when we just look out the window or look over the seawall over there. We certainly have the wealth. But again, in today's world where we are small in terms of governments and so on, and we are still ruled with democracies, so we get people in government who are there for 4 years. Short-term views. Investment is about long-term investments. And small entrepreneurial, as we get started, is like a seed. You're not going to have your business, it starts here, but it's got to grow. If it doesn't grow, it's likely to die. So I think this is the whole part, again, of coming back and ensuring governments look at programs that we have to empower and enable our people. Again, and I would always keep coming back to that, having been around this interactions with governments and stakeholders, but especially governments. We say to them, you have the lead role, government. Do it. But we are right beside you. Thanks.
Thank you. Sustainability is about taking a long-term perspective. But I really wanted to ask whether there are innovations that you think would be significant in the blue economy space that would enable organisations to take a long view but also get a short-term economic return.
One of the things that I've come to realize, so I run a conservation organization, so a global NGO called Conservation International, and our mission is really to protect nature for people. Now, that added bit, for people, is particularly in there because I think long ago, frankly, I think before most of the other organizations really understood this, we had this belief that if it isn't in the enlightened self-interest of local communities, indigenous peoples, local organizations, governments, conservation just won't happen at scale. And the way I like to talk about it is I think about the road to protection has to run through production. That production and protection should forever be linked. And if you can't link that, then it's really actually quite hard to sustain protection. And I would also argue that in a world that is running out of resources, it's also quite hard to think about production in the long run if you don't have that linkage. So let's talk about something that, it's funny to think about this as an innovation because the idea has been around forever. So, if you go and ask any marine scientist why you should protect a piece of ocean, they will tell you, right, that one of the main reasons to do that is because when you protect a piece of ocean, the fish that live there go to be exponentially bigger and lay exponentially more eggs, which will then help repopulate other parts of the ocean. Right? This is like mantra. This is like we've been taught this since like the beginning of graduate school or even undergraduate, and it's like drummed into our heads. You protected this area, it means there's more fish for everyone. And this is sold as a way of protecting, coastlines in California, in the US, around the world. Like, this is like the number one reason, conservationists say you ought to do this. But, it's never actually been tested at scale. Not the science, but the actual mechanism itself. right? It's never actually been tested at scale. I just came from a panel this morning where one of the speakers, Enrique Sala, who runs Pristine Seas, is a famous scientist, talked about how in the U.S. some waters that have been protected, have now allowed more fish around, and fisheries has now grown up. Like it's gone up. So they're catching more longline tuna in the United States than ever before, partly because some areas are permanently closed to fishing. So what happens if you actually could create a link between the two things? And that's what we have tried to experiment with. So in Indonesia right now, on the entire coast of Sumatra, we're talking 1 million square kilometers of ocean, there's a giant experiment going on. It's called Blue Halo S. And the idea behind it is, like, if you protect this part of the ocean, it creates a halo effect around it, right? So this is strictly protected, let's say, and no one can fish there. Means there's a halo where more fish should be abundant. And what happens if we then charge, say, a premium for fisheries vessels to use that space? That premium then goes back into the protection of the core protected area. And so with the Green Climate Fund's help and others, the government of Indonesia is investing in this pretty large-scale model. I think that is an absolutely transferable idea for the rest of the Pacific, for really any country that has, marine space. Not just protecting it, but actually linking the economic well-being of your fisheries fleet with the protection of a certain part of the ocean. Then they're intertwined, and really intertwined forever. And each has an incentive in continuing to make sure the other exists.
That blue halo example is really exciting. I'd love to hear, how was that made possible? Was there a lot of resistance from the local community? Just thinking about, how would people hearing that example think about enabling that in their own environment?
So obviously this is recorded in a public meeting. So, read between my lines. So it took a long, long time. I think probably about 6 years before the agreement was essentially formalized by the Indonesian government. I think there were really two challenges. The first challenge is getting ministries that typically don't work together to really collaborate and coordinate with one another. The head of our Asia Pacific program, Richard Gio, is here in the front, and he could go into great details about exactly the mechanism to make this happen. But when I went for the signing, we didn't just have the ministry, who's responsible for fisheries or the oceans. We also had, finance there and the other ministries. So you had to get them all to collaborate. And in our case, we had one champion, the coordinating minister, Pak Luhut, who is quite a politically powerful figure who really, really kept up the effort on this. The second is the Green Climate Fund coming in to signal that they would be interested in fast-tracking something like this, to provide some level of loans as well as some level of granting mechanisms, because you need some funding, and other conservation organizations. And then the third one, which is actually quite interesting, was finding a piece of oceanscape that did not have, that was still open for this kind of experimentation. So the coast of Sumatra became the area to work in because there are not that many protected areas there. It's sort of open, and it doesn't have the intensity of scrutiny that maybe a more famous part of Indonesia would have. So I think it's finding a place that is a safe zone to try this. It's getting the ministries to all collaborate and be willing to do it, and then getting a multilateral or a government external agency to come in and underwrite some part of this effort.
That's fabulous. If I wasn't holding a mic, I'd clap. That's a really really great to hear that. Amanda.
It's saying on. So, absolutely fabulous too. Wanted to give a similar example at a smaller scale in Fiji and the Asawas. And this is to give you hope, Sanjan, that philanthropic capital came in and was a catalyst for an area called Barefoot Manta Island. And they had an experiment where they created their own marine protected area with agreement with the local villages for ecotourism. And this is something we're thinking about now for future jobs. And so really exciting to see in comparison with some of the other local resorts, and I was just there last month, 112 documented species of coral. I was completely blown away. And a manta within 30 seconds of getting into the water, just extraordinary. And they said that it was threefold. So recognizing that with the climate crisis and more burning of fossil fuels, the ocean is warming and acidifying, and that is impacting corals, which impacts the fish. They looked at that and said, okay, well, we can't control that piece, but we can control the overfishing. So very similar to Sanjan's example, but at a micro level. And then they looked also at runoff, and they said we can control, as an ecotourism resort, very carefully what goes into the ocean. And when I ran NZ Aid, we were doing work with the Cook Islands, and we were realizing that the more fertilizers and pesticides that were used to ramp up production on land, the worse the runoff, the more the algal blooms, the worse it was. So we also need to be thinking about an ecosystem approach. So blue sustainability means green sustainability too. And I think what is exciting is as the science progresses, we realize that regenerative agriculture is actually cheaper and better in the long run, and it is better for the blue economy too. I wanted to just pick up on comments that a couple of colleagues made, and love this idea about the mindset change, and we really do need a long-term mindset. There's no, I guess, coincidence that 5% of people on the planet who happen to be Indigenous steward over 80% of the remaining biodiversity. This notion of what we call in Aotearoa New Zealand, kaitiakitanga, or stewardship, is very important. We have to be guardians, as you said so well, Howard, and we need to be empowering people. And just to come back to the investment climate comment, I was part of the original team at the IFC working on doing business, and could not agree more. It's laid out pretty clearly, even with the new name, the new project. But one of the things we realized was Saudi Arabia was in the top 10, and women weren't even allowed to go outside of the house, let alone do business. So just bringing that gender dimension in, which has now happened, and the bank has a very integrated dimension. And also seeing how exciting it is that the World Bank now has a new mandate. It's not just about alleviating poverty, but it's about alleviating poverty on a livable planet. So climate is integrated, and we have a $38 billion fund with the Green Climate Fund, but we now also have a significant amount of capital through the World Bank and the IFC that can be harnessed in similar ways. And just finally on innovation, love this idea about you as an entrepreneur and what sort of spurred that innovation. When we look now, and given that I work for the Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation, bringing those two things together, we come back to ecosystem services, and I promise this is the last data point I'll give you this time, and that when Sanjan pointed out how important it is to be thinking about what we get from nature that is free. The OECD did a study a couple of years ago estimating that the free ecosystem services that we obtain from nature is somewhere in the environments of $100 trillion a year. So if we kill the pollinators and we stop, things are going extinct at unprecedented rates, that is actually going to be an enormous problem. So we need to fix it now instead of waiting until it is too late. So thinking about that innovation and tech. And one example I absolutely loved was the work that I think part of Sanjan's team is doing, working with small-scale fishers with technology to be able to be sure that they are sustainable. And so in the supply chain, going right up to what we run, the Sustainability Consortium, which is $1 trillion of front-facing consumer goods, including Walmart as an anchor partner. Then, as Sanjan says, and as our colleague, I can't remember the name, mentioned, you can have a race to the top because people will pay a premium knowing that that was sustainably caught and that allows governments to clamp down on what is not sustainably caught.
Amanda, it's almost as if you read my notes. You covered so much that I wanted to talk about there, which was, are we doing enough to invest in climate, but also with a gender lens, because we know that women are so impacted by the way in which climate change affects communities. And we know that currently only 2% of investment in climate has that length. That's a 2020 number. You talked a lot about innovation and technology, and technology and data has been a key theme that's come across in the last couple of days. And I wanted to turn the question really to Ken to talk about, how can data and technology be used to really understand what's going on in our blue economy? And it'd be great if you could give some examples.
Thanks, Louise. So there's a lot of examples that could be used. So some of our recent work that we're doing in Fiji, together with the Foreign Fisheries Agency. So we've recently just built a system for Fiji that will account for every single landed fish in Fiji. So fish that comes off every single commercial fishing vessel will be tracked and traced throughout the supply chain. So. So that capability hasn't been there, and this is going to tie into things like CAT certification so that you can access certain markets. They're going to look at things like sustainability, the legality of the catch. So it opens up a lot of opportunities, and I think Fiji is probably one of the first countries in the Pacific that will be doing that in the Pacific. And I think going back to the great example that Sanjayan had shared about Indonesia, I think similar to that, the Pacific has been a leader in fisheries, particularly in tuna. We have the best managed tuna stock of all the species in the Pacific. And that's been through collaboration amongst all the small island states or big ocean states, whatever you want to call it. And there have been some really, innovative instruments. For example, like the parties to the Nauru Agreement have the Vessel Day Scheme, where fishing vessels pay a premium to fish in those particular waters in the Pacific. And that has certainly raised, economic revenue for many of the countries in the Pacific. But going back to the climate change topic, those instruments and those processes, the technology that we've relied on in the past, probably needs to adapt and transform to address the challenges that we're facing right now. Thanks.
Thank you. And at that juncture, I'm going to hand over to Howard to ask, local organisations and local businesses, what part do you see them playing in really making sure that the blue economy is resilient?
I think preservation, conservation has got to be high on the agenda here as we try to manage, and as you rightfully said, we're stewards of it. We don't own the assets. We're here for a while and then we're off, and what we leave for our children and grandchildren and our future generations is critical. So the working with small groups in places like Fiji, and I guess most of the Pacific Islands, we still have village-based life. People are not all living in the city, in apartments, in multi-story buildings and so on. And therefore, these are the people really who are the watchdogs, but they're also the consumers of it. And the risk of their preservation, that is often the private sector. The boat who comes along with cash on the beach, I'll take this, I'll weigh this, I'll take it away, whether it's that big or that big or that big. And this is where the monitoring and the policing of it is important. Of course, who has to police that? And of course, we have our fisheries and so on. But of course, they don't have 100 patrol boats and so on. I've got to be careful what I say about patrol boats because we just lost a couple in the last few months. Now I will change the subject. But monitoring these assets has been a success story in Fiji too, for many of the villages where they've said, we don't fish here for a year. And, I've personally been with people and said, then after just a few months, people say, hey, we see the fish jumping again. You know, it's there. There's the evidence, and you don't need any more convincing. So I think we just have to do more of that. And because a lot of our people living on islands, away from the big islands and so on, they've got to understand what the assets are out there and what they can do to preserve at the same time while they consume. That's okay. It's not the consuming. It's actually when the commercialization of it is the big problem. So again, you know, private sector has a role there, but we still need the government to monitor and pull the trigger if they need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Sanjay, I know you gave us a great example of the Blue Halo initiative, and we've heard some good examples of some technology that's available. What are the key factors that enable investment to be attracted to these conservation projects? And you referred to philanthropists being risk adverse. Is it the use of technology? Is it having proven data points that enable them to think it's lower risk? How can we try to set up bankable programs, because we understand that there is climate finance available, to ensure that conservation is prioritised in the blue economy?
What I would say, so when I got started in conservation 30 years ago as a young graduate student, no, not 30, 25 years ago, it's a long time ago, you know, I think there was really just two models for getting work done. Right? We either got private money from some rich person, mostly male, mostly older, and then went and spent it in a place to do some good work, help a community, protect an animal, restore an area, or buy land, right? Buy land. Or we lobbied governments, either through, you know, in multiple ways, campaigned and lobbied governments to declare an area protected or change a law in order to do this. That was it. That was the two models of conservation. And for many years, we've been sort of okay with that, and it's got us to where we are. In the last 5 years, that has completely changed. So if I actually look at how I spend my time, the way I spend my time today versus 5 years ago, completely changed. And that's because of the private sector. So the amount of money now flowing into nature-based solutions writ large is orders of magnitude beyond anything that I would have imagined. I still think we're scratching the surface. I actually still think it's much, much bigger than what I'm imagining. But already for us, for my organization, and I suspect for others as well, it's almost overwhelming. Like, we have to pick and choose our partners now because the amount coming at us, or the opportunities coming at us, is more than the team can handle. If you just look at our team, of the different people at Conservation Center, we have about 1,800 team members around the world. The team that is fastest grown is the conservation finance team, so the nature-based financing team. It's the fastest growth in the last 3 years or so. So that tells you something, right? It tells you something. And that's the good news. There's a lot of capital trying to find places to invest. And that is because, you know, there are very few things that are like actually true in this world, like truisms, right? If you are all business investors, this is a business forum, which is perfect to have this and to talk about this particular subject. If I asked you, what would you invest in? I'm playing your game, which is managed, which is asking the audience, you know, what would you invest in today that you think you can make a return in 5 or 10 years? There's probably a fair number of companies or indices that you could invest in today with some confidence that you're going to make a return in the next few years. But if I made that longer and longer, if I said in 30 years, what would you invest in? Now you're probably picking sectors like healthcare or maybe AI. What happens if I said 50 years? What happens if I said 100 years, which is really not that long? We're talking then your grandchildren, right? Like, what would you put money in now that would pay dividends to your grandkids? It's really hard to actually think of any company that will last 100 years, right? Like, it's really, really quite hard to do that. It's very impossible to think that any of the tech companies are going to be around in that length of time. They certainly haven't in the past. So the one thing that you could say would hold its value and probably grow in value is nature. In some way, shape, or form, nature tomorrow is going to be more valuable than it is today, which means there's a line, there's a curve. I don't know the shape of that, but it is something that looks like this. And if it's this upward curve, then you surely should be able to create a business around it, especially if you have a long enough timeline, right? And you have some mechanism to de-risk your initial investments and provide some certainty for short-term things. So one of these is restoration, the restoration economy. It's just taking off in terms of how many projects there are now to restore bits of nature. It's mostly terrestrial, but it could easily be marine as well. And then in carbon, like it is a massive, massive inflow, but other things too, like water and things like that. And really the impediment to that is not the capital. It's there. Right now it's there, at least for organizations our size, it's there. We currently advise on about $1.5 billion of funding. So there's $1.5 billion that's going into nature-based solutions that we are the impact advisors on. And that's really without us even trying. We could 10x that if we had the team and if we had investable projects on the ground. So that's the hard thing, to actually find investable projects on the ground. You know, just before the pandemic, I had a meeting with the CEO of Delta Airlines. And the CEO, Ed Bastian, said, I want to put $300 million into Ghana, into West Africa, into carbon and nature-based projects, $300 million into Ghana. He was thinking Ghana and potentially Nigeria, but basically West Africa, because that is a hub for them, and they were planning on growing their market share there. The truth is he couldn't invest that. We did not pursue that. Now, COVID hit and the airline industry changed and there was a whole other thing. But he had the intention, but there was no way they could deploy that capital on the ground. The projects just aren't there of a high quality, which is why you get a lot of shenanigans and a lot of sort of snake oil salesmen, right? So if you can develop great projects that are to some extent de-risked, ideally initially funded by philanthropy, there is investable money out there.
You talked about a lack of quality being an issue. And how do we solve that? Do we need more standards to assist with quality? Is it not having enough expertise? What's creating that issue?
I mean, it's a fantastic question to ask, and it's not an easy question to answer. I think it's a lot of factors. So I don't think it's a lack of data. I think it's a lack of, so to get these projects certified through the existing mechanisms is just simply too long. Just way too long. And if you're a community, you're a small island state, you do not have the resources to wait that length of time. So we got to shorten that, and probably technology is part of it. To get a project audited just takes too long. Government uncertainty is certainly one of the big impediments, meaning that governments in many places just haven't made a pronouncement on whether or not they're going to go with a carbon market, what share they want. You saw what Zimbabwe did kind of overnight, basically saying something like 80% of the carbon markets are going to be the government's. Well, I'll tell you what, most companies aren't going to go invest because that money is going to governments. They will invest if the money is going to communities, right? So an equitable way to share money with communities is critical. And then government saying, like, if we set the rules up, we're going to live with those rules for 10 years or 20 years, right? That's an impediment to it. So I'd say speed of getting projects certified. I'd say, lack of policy coherence with governments. Some, as I said, are doing, like Colombia, there's a market there, it's pretty good. I think Philippines, Kenya, you can do carbon projects in these countries and and make it work. There's also this interesting idea that countries can trade carbon between countries around using Article 6. That's something that we think quite positively about. So a country like Singapore, trying to meet its NDCs, could go to Fiji, for example, and try and make a carbon swap happen. But those are probably the top things that come to mind. It is not that there are not good companies willing to put money into this. And look, I'll make one last point and then I'll shut up because I've said so much on this. Eventually, there is going to be a giant machine that sucks carbon and can do it at a price point that is affordable. It doesn't exist today. Like carbon capture cannot be done today at a reasonable price point. But eventually technology will get there. I'm sure of that. I'm sure of that. However, where do you think those machines are going to be located? They're not going to be in the global south. They're going to be in Norway, maybe in UAE. They're going to be in Texas. So the exact same places that benefited from the oil economy will now have the machines to suck that back out and charge us all for it. If you really want to empower rural economies, then nature-based markets are almost the only way to provide jobs in the global south, in the rural communities that are so important.
It's funny you should say that, because I know a Norwegian entrepreneur working on exactly that thing. Amanda.
Yes, just wanted to jump in. We happen to have the scientist who invented direct air capture 20 years ago, the theoretical physicist Klaus Lochner, who we both know. And interestingly, if you look at Iceland, where there is a company, probably the only one in the world, taking carbon out at scale, called Climeworks, it's being mineralized by a company next door called Carbfix, run by a woman entrepreneur who happened to be one of our We Empower, Women Entrepreneurs Empower, UN SDG Challenge awardees this year. She can take it out at $25 a ton and put it away. Now, Microsoft's paying $700 a ton next door. For all those countries that have geothermal, come and see me afterwards, Vanuatu, Indonesia, there is opportunity if the substrate is the right kind of substrate. You can turn it into limestone. It mineralizes as pyrite and calcium carbonate in just a couple of years. So I think there's huge opportunities there in relation to geothermal that could include the global south. So we're going to talk more about that afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn over to Colin to get you the potential or the perspective of an investor as to what you think the opportunities and the risks are, and what is critical to be in place before you'd be willing to invest.
I mean, I think we've spoken about quite a few of those. I suppose just what's required in an investor to do some of these. And I mean, the next time you find yourself in the northeast hinterlands of Sierra Leone, you may look out for a business that's called Miro Forestry, which is a timber business, and it's got about 17 million trees in the middle of nowhere in Sierra Leone. So, and what did we learn from that as an investor? Because I think these are the lessons that we need to apply to the blue ocean economy. I mean, the first one is patience. I mean, we invested in Miro Forestry and started it in 2015. We are still waiting for it to be profitable, which it will happen real soon, but patience. The second one is partners. I mean, you can't start a new business, and especially a business that is founded on conservation, without partners. And for us, we had partners with local businesses, we had partners with the government, we had partners with other DFIs. And the third one is flexibility. And I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how quick technology changes, and all of this kind of fascination with innovation is a reflection on the speed of change. And every business owner will recognize how business plans have to pivot. So in 2015, we invested in a business that was a timber business to create wood, to create plywood, to build homes. In 2023, we find ourselves invested in a carbon sequestration company. So the third point is flexibility. But if you have patience, you have partners, and you're willing to accept the flexibility, then I think that you are prepared to invest in things like the blue economy.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up. I'm going to ask each of my panelists really for a reflection or a call for action. And I'm going to start with Amanda.
So absolutely subsidies, and there is a call to action for everybody. The Vila Declaration is advocating that the World Trade Organization, of which many Commonwealth countries are prominent members, ban subsidies that are not green subsidies. So tell your MP, let's try and ban these ridiculous fossil fuel, agricultural and fisheries subsidies that are leading a race to the bottom, not the top, and let's all come together and agree that the only subsidies we should allow are actually green subsidies.
Thank you.
It just takes a second. So what I would say is that it's perfect to make sure that the Business Forum really focuses on this. You know, if you increasingly, when you go to the climate conference at COP, or if you go to the Convention on Biodiversity, which is happening right now in Cali, Colombia, you know, you will see quite a big presence by businesses. At the Montreal COP, we had, you know, I mean, it was astonishing. It almost felt like, as a scientist, you were the minority compared to the community, which is mostly business. That tells you something. I think the business community is incredibly important to this. It's the only one that will see long-term. Governments won't. They really won't. Like, when a political change happens and a government changes, you know, the policy will come to a grinding halt. I mean, remember when Donald Trump became president and pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord, you know, something like 80 companies took a full-page ad in the New York Times. You know, companies ranging from Walmart to Coca-Cola to Tiffany's saying, we're still in, right? Because I think companies are building value for their shareholders for the long run, for the most part. And so you play a hugely important role in this. And I think the key thing for you to do is to look for philanthropic capital to help move things fast, but then government certainty so that you as a business leader can come in. You can get meetings with business, with government that I can't. Companies can do this because it's about jobs, right? It's about votes. So the voice you have is very powerful. And those governments listen to you much more than they'll listen to me. And I think you need to use that voice to find that certainty. Thank you.
Thank you. Howard.
With all due respect to the sciences that have been, that you and I could understand here today, I certainly appreciate that. But I believe the solution rests in our people. The solution rests in our connectivity as human beings. We do a lot of communication and so on, but few connect, as the saying goes. So I honestly believe we have the solutions within our reach. We've talked about some here, but again, I believe in the end, our common wealth, our regional assets rest right out there, and we're looking at each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin.
I guess my summary would be brand is a route to scale for small island states. And this is not, I wouldn't say it's a well-trodden route, but it's not unknown. So, I mean, the island of Hawaii managed to brand pineapples made in Hawaii and extract enormous amount of value for decades. And today, I am just awestruck that Fiji has managed to brand water. I mean, anyone who can brand water is a master. So that is my suggestion. Let us create a brand for sustainable fishing in the special economic zones of the Pacific Island states.
Ken.
Thanks. So I think the challenges that we're facing in the blue and green economies, like climate change, kind of need to be met by us through the ability to be able to, I guess, adapt and transform the management processes that we've had, the technology and tools and the business models that we've relied on in the past. Yeah, and I think in that adaptation and that transformation, there's opportunities for businesses like us and for business in general to be able to innovate and to make impactful change. And I wonder if the Commonwealth as a whole probably could be a catalyst of some sort to help us ensure that resilient future of ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Thank you to my panellists. I learned a great deal and I've come away really enthused, and I hope you are all too. The blue economy is a huge opportunity for the Commonwealth. I think one of the key messages that I've certainly taken away is that we need to work together in partnership to ensure that our oceans are both protected, but also that the opportunities there are explored. Thank you so much.